Child Bereavement by ACAM at the All Nations Centre in Cardiff. And a big welcome to everybody who's watching online as well, because we have a big following today. It's set to be a really good day, a really exciting day. We have 4 absolutely excellent speakers who I'm really excited to hear from today. But before I pass you on to them, just a few practical issues before we start for those in the room. If you haven't seen the toilets, they're just outside along the corridor on your left. There'll be 3 breaks today. There'll be 2 coffee breaks and 1 lunch break. All the coffee and lunch will be served in here, but please feel free to use the social spaces in the All Nations Centre, and if you need to break out of the room, that's absolutely fine. I just wanted to say a little bit about ACAM before we start. So if you haven't been to an ACAM conference before, we run conferences just like this all across the UK for all different types of topics and reasons. We're a multi-agency organisation, so we try to include anyone and everyone from social workers, psychologists, psychiatrists, doctors, so as many different people as we can really. And our ultimate goal is to share CPD and networking between each other for young children and adolescents with mental health needs, or just to promote wellbeing generally. If you are interested in finding out a little bit more about ACAM, we're a membership organisation. We rely on you not just attending the events, but to be as much involved as you can. Please chat to one of us on the branch committee. There's 4 of us here today. If you want to give a wave, that would be great. Thank you. And we can tell you a bit more about it. I'll leave you now with the very capable hands of Professor Ilora Finlay. And thank you very much. I'd like to welcome you up.
Do I just do something here? Yeah, I do. That's it. Perfect. Thank you. Well, thank you for asking me to come today. I want to take a slightly different view because I want you to think about children before they're bereaved. Early on, what happens and how the path is laid. I come across I come across peers in the House of Lords who can tell me decades on, word by word, minute by minute, how they were told that their parent had died. Who can describe the room that they were in, the colour of the chairs, everything. It is branded on their memory. And that lonely, cold isolation of being delivered a phenomenal shock. And I think we have to think as a society, why aren't we doing things better? Because we should be doing things better. So I also want to draw on work by other people. I'm unashamedly, but I'm going to tell you whose work it is. So I'm not really, I hope I'm not plagiarising. I do think it's worth thinking though about the public conversation that the princes have really generated. And perhaps my only anxiety is that in our instant world, that this is going to fade from people's memory just as other things do. Because newspapers are unbelievably fickle. You know, today's news is tomorrow. Well, it used to be tomorrow's fish and chip wrappings. It's now tomorrow's bin liner, really, isn't it? But it's just here and gone. And yet, actually, they did open up layers that people need to talk about. And I think have probably done more for anybody else, for bereaved children than anybody else has. I just thought this was an interesting quote from Ian Rankin, who's a photographer who has judged some photographic competitions from the hospice world. Because actually art is incredibly expressive and is often a clue to knowing what's happening, both the way that people use the arts to be expressive or the things that they choose. I've often been struck that teenagers in particular give you a clue to how they feel through the music that they start to play at hideous volume. And it's often hideous, well, a cacophony of sound really, but it does give away an awful lot about them and often can be a route to express what they can't put into words. But the problem, I think, one of the things that we face in society now is that death is not familiar. The days of going into labour knowing that you may not survive it are over. We all expect to come out the other side of giving birth with a healthy baby and to be healthy and to recover really quickly, 48 hours, and you should be up and doing the dishes and so on again. But the reality was that child death of young people was everywhere. And that historic context was not that long ago. We're celebrating 70 years of the NHS, but to quote Nye Bevan, it's the mother in the average family who suffers most from the absence of a free health service. And in his book, In Place of Fear, he describes how awful it is, or was, but is in the terms of the book, for the mother who has a sick and dying child and who can't afford to get any help for that child. And of course, medicine could do remarkably little in those days anyway. But the reality of people who died either in war or in accidents as well, young parents who then would be dead, leaving a family, often with no father and absolutely nothing to fall back on. And I do worry that we've forgotten that. And Kath Mannix has just this month published a book which I would recommend to you. I mean, it's getting 5 stars on the reviews, and it is one of the few books which I really can't put down. Most books I fall asleep over at night, but this one kept me awake, carrying on reading. She's describing a series of case vignettes from her many decades in palliative medicine, but with a gentleness and a beauty to her writing, which really does allow you to get back in touch with your own emotions about looking after patients and their families, and reflect on things that have happened in your own lives. And it is very beautifully written. And it is about the fact that we really have stopped being familiar with death. So death is behind closed doors. We don't expect it until we're 80 plus. And it often has been happening in hospitals, and it still does, even though we talk about people dying at home. And then the type of deaths that happen more out in the community are traumatic, actually, traumatic deaths, road accidents, and the suicide rate is going up phenomenally. And it made me also think about, what are we doing to prepare children and young people? How are we looking after them when they have a parent who is ill, and particularly a parent who's got mental health problems, perhaps? These children are going to school because we think that's keeping things normal, but they're getting into trouble if they run home from school. But then if you've come home and found your parent hanging from the banisters once, then every day you go out the house worrying that you're going to come in and find them hanging again, but this time not be able to get them down, that they won't survive, or finding them having overdosed or whatever. And when the parent is ill, I worry that we don't always automatically say, is there a child being affected by this? When somebody's brought into the emergency department, are staff routinely saying, is there a child who needs to know what's happened? Because if this goes badly wrong, they need to be prepared now. They need to be gently told and involved, rather than their imagination run riot with them, because that imaginary view will be emblazoned on their memory and make any bad news even worse. So I do think it's almost like taking a life course view of bereavement and looking pre-bereavement, because the bereavement and the grief is happening from the moment that things aren't right, from the moment that the child picks up that things aren't right and carries on through. Quite a few years ago now, I did a study with Manchester University, and we were looking at the knowledge of children when the parents were a year after a diagnosis of cancer, any stage of cancer. And what was astounding was that about 9 out of 10 parents thought the children didn't really know what was going on. And 9 out of 10 children knew everything. They had overheard the conversations. They'd sat on the stairs. They'd seen envelopes arrive in the post. It was in the days before emails and so on. So they would see letters arrive with an appointment from the hospital. They knew everything, absolutely everything. They could see that mum or dad did not look so well. They picked up the word mentioned on the phone to somebody, or even worse, they had been told in the playground by another child what was going on with their parent. And the other book that I just want to draw to your attention was just launched this week. And Sasha's son, Didi, died of a brain tumour. And of course, there's been a lot of publicity because of Tessa Jowell around brain tumours at the moment. But Sasha was in his teens, and she has written a very powerful book, and she's a very dynamic woman, about the need to actually do what's right for your child, and how she had to discover how to get help at home, how to get people involved, what she could and couldn't do. And she says that one of the worst moments was coming out of hospital. And this wasn't for her, this was for another parent actually that she's describing. But a mum coming out of hospital, having just been with a child that died, and getting in the car, and there are the child's trainers on the back seat. And that was just so hard. And then going home, and of course the other children in the family may not have been there, may not have been involved really, may not have seen the death. They're only getting second-hand reports of what happened. So that's another book which I think is really on the must-read list, because she's drawn on the experiences of many other parents who've lost a child and how it's gone forward. So really, what can we do about it? Well, I think that probably the thing that health care services generally are good at doing is transmitting, but what they're not good at doing is listening. And this is the Chinese symbol for listening. And basically, it describes how you listen with your ears, but you listen with who you are, and that includes picking up all the non-verbal cues that you can see around you, but most importantly, with undivided attention and from the heart. And the child or young person in particular, who knows that they've got space to express what their concerns are. So that it's so important that when a parent is ill, that the school knows, that other people around know that there is some secure network put in place before the disaster happens, before the tragedy happens. Because otherwise you're stacking up problems. I don't know if you remember Sir Ainsley Green, Al Ainsley Green, who was the first children's commissioner. Well, his motivation and drive throughout life came from the way that he was told about his father's death when he was a child. Terribly, terribly traumatic. And he speaks very openly about it. But each time he speaks about it, you can feel that trauma come back up to the surface again. And that steered his whole life. He's done a great deal for children, and he's been a fantastic advocate for children. But in a way, I think it's a sadness that he still carries that burning anger inside him, many, many decades later. And just an example of why we need to explain things to children. This was a drawing done by a child whose father had died in hospital. And he thought that his father had burnt from inside. His father was red. He had what's called erythroderma. So he had bright red skin. That was part of his illness. But the child had thought that this was almost like being cremated from inside. He didn't understand because nobody had explained to him that Dad was red, just like you'd go red if you'd been in the sun a bit, but it didn't hurt at all. And that was quite separate to the body being burnt after death, and understanding what was happening. So I think we need to get healthcare to think of families as secondary patients. We have all this focus on the patient, and we have all this focus on confidentiality around the patient, which is right, but I do worry that we've carried it to an extreme now. And we've forgotten that actually the family are like gold dust in terms of information that we need to look after somebody, but they're also gold dust in terms of supporting each other into the future of the life without the person who's dying. And most people have a period before they die in which you can see that they really are almost certainly going to die. And then you can see that they really are dying. And then you can see that they are dying. And it's a recognizable pattern. And yet we're not involving young people. We may be talking to the so-called next of kin, which of course means nothing in law. That may not be the person who's closest to the patient. But children, obviously, as you all know, have all these questions and more. But every little bit of our behaviour affects what the child picks up and sees. And I really do worry that in training healthcare staff, and I don't mean undergraduate, I mean postgraduate and ongoing education, we're not raising awareness enough that every single little thing that they do makes an enormous difference. Children will hear the conversation that's carried on in the margins of a room, down a corridor. They will remember that. And of course, their hearing's more astute than the adults, so they'll probably hear even more than the adults do. The laughter that you can have at a nurse's station that echoes down the ward when you're in a room with somebody who's dying can be really offensive. Failure to bring the cup of tea, failure just to say, do you want orange juice? You know, or there are times when, you know, we can have sugary fizzy drinks. I think if your mum or dad's dying, Coca-Cola isn't going to do any harm at all. You know, we are a bit ridiculous, aren't we? It's a bit like the smoking in public places stuff and making hospitals no smoking zones. Well, I took that legislation through, but I have not that long ago said to somebody, I know you need a bit of fresh air. You go out for a bit of fresh air, and when you come back in, we'll have another chat. Because sometimes you do have to turn a blind eye. You'd have to do what's right for the person in front of you and chuck all these rigid rules out the window. And if you're breaking the law, so what? You won't get prosecuted and you won't get sacked. But I do think that we just haven't empowered staff enough to be in touch with their own humanity and actually do what's needed at the time. And I've got just a few photographs that were part of a photographic competition for Dying Matters, and I think they're quite powerful, really. And just say a bit about some of the pre-bereavement phase that I'm trying to focus on. This was one, and I think the words are really beautiful that she put with it. And it's very powerful, isn't it? But often the grandparent is the most stable person in a child's life. We know of families where it's the grandparents who actually have custody of the children. For whatever reason, things break down. But of course, those people are older. And then they are bringing up children through all of those bits of loss from that child's life that have accumulated. And then, of course, if they go and die before the child is really grown up and established and got a good support network around them, then the last pillar of security gets pulled away. And people talk about autonomy all the time and autonomy of the patient, as if it's a sort of I want, therefore I get, and as if we're all islands, but actually we're all interrelated, as I think this picture shows really beautifully. Oh, sorry. This man had just gone home from hospital with advanced metastatic cancer. He'd gone home, effectively he was to die at home. He wanted to spend his last time at home. And again, that's a really beautiful photo. And I'm sure for that little baby, as he grows up, that'll become a really important photo too. But it was Cicely Saunders who said, "How people die lives on in the memory of those left behind." And this little girl is sitting in a chair in the hospice in which her aunt died, and her mother had taken her in there. But again, just shows how things get handed on from generation to generation, and people live with them. And we talk about helping people make memory boxes so that those memories are kept alive and children have something to draw on. I think it's always interesting to see what the things are that children and grandchildren treasure. On a lighter note, my granddaughter has already let me know that she wants both my rings, my pearl necklace, which is currently in for being repaired, my earrings, and she'd like my watch too. Because she has already realised that with the others being boys, she can get the lot. So they'll go in the memory box for her. But things are important, and then we come across old photographs. And there's a real problem we've got now with everything being digital, because people have a digital legacy, but if it's locked behind passwords and closed doors, nobody can access it. So part of preparing young people for bereavement is actually to say, which of these pictures would you like to have? And just getting them printed off. Pictures of that child as a baby who is now coming into teens, with their parent, memories of happy holidays, because the days of the book, of the old photo album, aren't there anymore. It's all on people's phones and it's all mixed up. But if the child can't choose which picture, the adult's very likely to either not access or inadvertently delete the very picture that the child wants, because it's full of important memories. And of course, even when people write things, I know that they write, there's so much written on kind of instant media, which is pretty hideous stuff actually. And it can get nasty and it cannot be very helpful. But the considered writing of somebody is often done now on an electronic medium. Now, if that's locked behind, if a grandparent has written, or a parent has written a message to children to have later, but it's locked behind a password, nobody can get at it. I know there are a few places in Cardiff where you can get any computer unlocked and any phone unlocked, but that sort of feels invasive. It doesn't feel like planning and supporting and thinking ahead as to what will happen. Because otherwise, this is really what happened, as you all know. And that interrelatedness of us all is just so important. Jane is going to be speaking later on and did a really important study for us for the Palliative Care Implementation Board. Because if I can steal your thunder, Jane, that was kind of your headline, which was that in every single school class, on average, there will be 3 children who've suffered a serious bereavement, and one of those will have lost a parent or sibling. That's how it kind of pans out. And so really, not only is bereavement care the most effective form of preventive medicine, but if it doesn't happen pre-bereavement, then you've lost a really important opportunity to support the child through, because the numbers are huge and we all know the outcomes, don't we? We all know what happens if kids don't get support. They're going to go off the rails anyway for a bit, probably, as they grow up, but they're going to stay off the rails, seriously off the rails. And once they get into the criminal fraternity, of course, then there's a huge, huge problem, because they're into the school of major crime. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the work of Mark Bellis from Bangor. Are you? No. Okay. Well, that's good. Actually, it's a relief to me. Mark in Bangor, and it's his slides I'm going to show you now, and it's all credit to him. He's let me have them. But he's looked at adverse childhood experiences, and his data is really, I think, very powerful. He's pointed out that children, particularly in early life, as the brain is growing, have a response to stress, and it's critical restructuring in the brain that establishes empathy, trust, and a sense of community. And if there is a threat, the child gets a fight and flight and run away, after which, you know, they may well, or usually have cried a lot and been terrified and screamed, but they will be exhausted, and during a period of rest, their brain will recover from this state of heightened arousal. But if they are repeatedly in a state of heightened arousal, the brain doesn't recover. And the more adverse childhood experiences they have, the less there is recovery. And actually, this put me in mind of the child who's at school and worried that what they're going to find when they go home, because they will be sitting at school all day in a state of heightened anxiety. And that then won't ever reset itself down. But this is particularly in early life that this happens very rapidly and easily. And so you end up with a child with a state of chronic stress and really poor brain development, to the point that things which are neutral cues will be interpreted as threatening. So somebody's face that might look to the child as if it's angry or aggressive isn't actually, but they're in this state of heightened anxiety, and therefore all their responses are altered. And he looked rather alarmingly at what happens, and these are some of the different types of adverse childhood experiences that are classified by the World Health Organization. And he looked at the numbers suffered by children between the ages of 0 up to 18. And we don't come out well, I'm afraid. Looking across the whole of Europe, Eastern Europe, he compared us with Eastern Europe, where you think things are going to be pretty bad, actually. But our rate of childhood abuse is higher, I'm afraid. And when we look at the figures for Eastern Europe, this is what comes out. But for Wales, it's even worse. We come out higher on some. Parental separation is higher. Depressed and suicidal in the house is higher. Alcohol is remarkably close to Eastern Europe, where I would have expected it to be much higher with all their vodkas and so on. And then street drug user is higher with us. And almost half of children in Wales have suffered at least one adverse childhood experience, with 14% with 4 or more. And what happens? What's their risk of self-harm and suicide later on? Well, look at this. Their risk with 4 or more is huge compared to children who haven't had those adverse childhood experiences. Now, that's not about wrapping children in cotton wool, because you really do need to look at building resilience in children to cope, because life is going to be tough. Life will throw all kinds of awful things at them. But he's really suggested that the true building blocks of building resilience are these, and being grounded in your cultural traditions of feeling connected. That's why things like the photographs and where your family have come from and where your origins are become so important when you feel cut adrift. But in terms of all of the outcomes, the most important and influential seems to be 1 or more stable, caring child-adult relationship. And it doesn't seem to matter who that is. That doesn't have to be a blood relative. That is somebody who that child knows will always be there for them. Unconditional love. and other people will come and go and intervene. But actually that ongoing long-term shelter, that haven to which they can go, seems to be the most important thing of all for children in building resilience, which is why people who are important to the child need to be involved pre-bereavement and during the time of a death. They shouldn't be excluded or kept out or kept away. If that child relates closely to them, it may be a friend of the family rather than a relative. It may be one of their teachers at school. And then that teacher may have some difficulties because they're kind of professional boundaries as well imposed by the school. And of course, if that's the current class teacher, they'll be handing on to somebody else. So that transition needs to be planned for as well in the whole course of events. If the child fortunately goes to some other kind of activity, it may be whoever's running that activity. Those of you that know the orchestra, well, it used to be called Cardiff and Vale, I think. It used to be called South Glam, and it's now Cardiff and Vale Orchestra. But when we were trying to get Eric Phillips's contribution to that orchestra recognised, I had one letter from a youngster who said that when her parent died, her haven of peace and sanity was to go once a week to orchestra. That was her fixed point. Eric had no idea. None. He was completely clueless. And yet that fixed point of continuity was so important. So Jane's going to talk to you about what she's done, but this is the hard data really. And I think you might be presenting it later. So I'll whip past. But in Wales, part of what was Dying Matters, which was came out from NHS England's view that we need to talk much more openly about death and dying and what happens, has come the Welsh branch, which is Byw Nawr, which means live now. And really the theme has to be, what can you do? And that's about everybody communicating openly with each other about dying, about death and bereavement, and thinking about how they can keep children safe emotionally on that inevitable life journey that they're going to have, which is going to be tough. For some, it's going to be unbelievably tough. But the foundations, I think the evidence is emerging really strongly that if the foundations are set for the bad things to not be made worse by cack-handed, inappropriate, often well-meaning, but bad handling of a situation, then the final impact is slightly less awful. You can't make bad good. You know, people talk about a good death. Sasha in her book talks about Dee Dee's death as being a good death because what she felt they managed to do was actually get in place everything that Dee Dee wanted when he was dying as a teenager, but with phenomenal effort from the family. And some healthcare professionals definitely going the extra mile, and some services coming in absolutely at the last minute. And just stopping the whole thing breaking down. But how sad that they had to get to the point of screaming desperately for help. And obviously the trauma of his death is there for his sibling too. And because he was at home, his sibling was able to be there too. So that's why I think Cicely was so right when she said years ago, the memory lives on. It does live on. And then what we're doing with children after bereavement has often been set by what's happened before and the problems that they present us with. And I think that's why it's so important. That's why I'm so glad that a few years ago now with Michelle, we managed to get awareness of families into Velindre. I think before it was actually accepted around the rest of the UK. It was one of the first cancer centres where we were able to say, we've got to make sure that we're catering for these children. And our experience has certainly been that if we don't do that, we leave them with all kinds of terrible memories. And just the last point, that just a little anecdote, but there was a young man dying in Velindre. Michelle may remember him, 2 children. And the mum had not been able to tell the children that dad was dying. And I had a conversation with mum, and we agreed that we would rerun that same conversation fairly simply with the children in the room when she brought them in to see dad. So I went over it in very, very simple terms. And it was almost like a role play of retelling her the bad news in front of the children. And after time, I stopped from time to time and asked the children if they wanted to ask me anything. And of course, children never do. They're always silent. And this little boy was sitting there swinging his legs because his feet didn't touch the floor. And I said, well, is there anything at all? And he said, would Daddy like to see my Lego? So I said, I'm sure Dad would love to see your Lego. He might not be able to sit up and play with you now, and he might not really say much, but he will know that you're there. So go and get your Lego, which was in the back of the car. And fortunately, and this was a lesson I really learned from Michelle, is never think the job's done. Fortunately, I saw them again after they'd been in to see Dad, and I just hung around into the early evening and asked them what they thought, and of course they said nothing. And this little boy's legs started swinging again, which was a really good non-verbal cue that there was something. And he said, why do they keep sticking a needle in Dad? And my initial reaction was, what nurse has gone in there and given him a breakthrough injection in front of the children? That's just not appropriate. So I just asked him to tell me what he meant by that and explain. And he said, that little machine that you've got that keeps on sticking a needle into Dad all the time. And I asked him to go and show me the machine, and what it was the syringe driver. And every time it whirred, he thought that it was a machine sticking a needle into Dad, because he'd been told that that machine was there to keep Dad comfortable, so he didn't have pain. So all it took was just to take it apart and show him that actually it was soft plastic, and hold it in the air and let on one whir the drop come down, and that it's just like water, but it's got a little bit of pain relief in it, and reconnect it, and that there's no needle being pushed by the machine at all. And what really struck me was, if I hadn't had that conversation, if I hadn't just left that space for that child, and it was serendipity that I did, it was nothing clever, it was just chance, that child would have grown up for the rest of his life believing that when his dad was dying, he was in hospital attached to a machine that kept on sticking a needle into him every few seconds. And that would have been his memory, rather than that Dad saw his Lego. So that's just to set a bit of a scene for you from the beginning, I hope. Thank you. I think we've got some time for questions, haven't we? And I'm very happy to take questions or comments, or anyone who wants to disagree with something I've said. And
yeah, right, okay.
Yeah.
I was interested to hear what you said about the build-up to death. So they're going to die, then they're nearly dying, and then that is quite a difficult thing to explain, isn't it, to people, that there are stages, although they're being told they're dying, but you're not quite there.
Yeah, and Kath actually deals with it beautifully in her book. I think that the press make it sound as if something terrible and awful is going to suddenly happen and people will have a terrible death. And that's not what most deaths are like. And actually, they shouldn't be like that. And people should have things in place so that if something starts to go wrong, then they know immediately what to do and how to act and who to call. I mean, one of the classics is that if somebody hasn't had pain problems, they're not likely to get pain problems. But I don't think we spell it out enough. We don't say, look, do you want to know what is likely to happen? And you're likely to become more and more tired, and you'll go to sleep and you'll wake up again. And as you get more and more tired and weary, you'll slip into a coma. That's not going to sleep. That's quite different, because each time you wake up, you won't wake up quite as fully. So the background is that you go into a coma. I must say it's really important that nobody says to children, Daddy went to sleep and didn't wake up again. You know, and things like that, because they're always frightened of everyone going to sleep. And
well, I didn't sleep for years because somebody told me my grandmother had gone to sleep. And I honestly, I can remember it vividly, that every night then I was thinking 3 o'clock and I was thinking, if I go to sleep now, I might not wake up in the morning. And it did have a very devastating effect on teenage years. And it wasn't until my own dad died when I was in my 40s that I realised that, why was I so worried? You know, but it took from 40
because somebody had told you to be. But that's it, it's a classic, and people need to know that they can go to sleep, they'll be tired, go to sleep and wake up again. But when they're very near the end and they're in that very, very deep drowsy state and slipping into coma, gradually their breathing will just get less and less strong. And it'll slow, and it may become a little bit irregular, and it may get more shallow at times, and then it will stop, and their heart will stop as well. Nothing sudden, nothing dramatic. You know, there isn't a cloud burst and the heavens open and the cymbals bang or whatever. But we don't spell that out enough to people. So they get all of these fears around how they're likely to die. The other one that really worries me hugely is the morphine myth. The view that somehow morphine shortens your life. And it doesn't. All the evidence is there that if you've got good symptom control, you live longer. You also live better. Your quality of life scores will be better, and you're less likely to be depressed as well. But the evidence is that you live better longer with good symptom control. And actually, you don't kill people with morphine. There's always a last dose of drug, just like there's always been a last cup of tea. But the cup of tea doesn't kill somebody, and the last dose of drug doesn't kill somebody. But people need to have that explained. So the level of pain or other symptom relief, it has to be kept topped up all the time. It's a bit like a car with the engine running. You know, the level goes down, so you top it up, and the level goes down again. All you're doing with a breakthrough dose is topping up again. You're not going into overdose. And even if you do go into accidental overdose, you don't kill people. I've seen people who've accidentally had the whole of their 24-hour dose in an hour or two. And I've seen people who've been given the wrong medication because there's been a drug error and they've had a massive overdose. And all that happens is that they wake up and say, I've had a jolly good sleep. And very, very rarely, I can only think of 2 occasions where we've actually had to reverse the morphine. Usually if you just sit it out, it'll wear off, because it does wear off and they'll wake up again. As an aside, and it worries me because it's all getting muddled up with the euthanasia debate that's in the media a lot. If you, to kill yourself with assisted suicide, you take 9 or 10 grams of barbiturate. Now that's absolutely massive. That's about 50 to 100 tablets. And barbiturates aren't something that are used therapeutically in end-of-life care really anyway. But actually, if for euthanasia, you inject someone with a short-acting anaesthetic agent and then with curare to paralyse them, and they die of asphyxia because they're totally paralysed, so they don't breathe. So that's why they die, which is completely different to managing somebody's, what I would call natural dying, as they slip away. The other thing, obviously, that people need to be told is that they can still talk to people, they can still tell them, they can still hear, even though they may be too weak to respond. They will know that you're there. And children can be told, play. You know, play on the floor. It doesn't matter if you make a noise, because it's nice for mum or dad or whoever it is to hear that you're there. And they can come and go in and out the room, and they have to be able to do what they feel comfortable with doing at the time. We had a young mum dying in Home Tower some years ago, and the 3 daughters had been her carers, and they were all underage at the time. And we put up camp beds for them in the room so that they could stay. And one of them wanted to be there with mum as she died. And the others said that they didn't, and they wanted to run in and out to the TV room. But actually they were running in and out because they sort of wanted to be there, but they didn't want to be there, but they still needed to be able to see what happened. And so it's just really important. But the sort of keeping children away doesn't do them any service.
Yeah, I think I totally agree. I think on a sort of having experienced it personally, I think definitely children going through it with their parents, it has been a good death, and however difficult it is amazing to see it and to watch it, and then see the afterwards of it, and how those children have been able to work through it quite well, because they experienced their dad's death. And it was
it's also that it's actually everybody's going to die. It's part of life. Yeah.
There's one book recommendation that came through on the live chat, which I thought I'd share with everyone here. Until I Say Goodbye by Susan Spencer Wendell. It's written by the author about how she's dying and preparing her children for her death as well. So I just wanted to share that with the room.
Yeah, thank you. And that, of course, the other thing linked to that, and that's incredibly helpful, is the importance of supporting people who are dying to prepare the children and young people. And it can be really helpful to specify which objects they may want to have, as well as writing things to them, but which things are actually theirs, and be involved so there's a kind of continuity and handing on. But being honest with people about what's happening, you know, I think that's the biggest thing of all, really. We all know if somebody's lied to us. Well, children know if somebody's lied to them too, and they'll never trust them again. So they have to know. Just one other little kind of anecdote, but there's a man who I've looked after for many years now, and on many occasions I thought he was dying, and had sat with the children, and then very sadly, when the youngest was 11, the mother died, and she had a pancreatic cancer, and I sat down with the children, and the older daughter, who I think was about 15, then said, but Ilora, and by then they knew we were on first name terms both ways, and she said, but Ilora, you've been wrong about Dad. Perhaps you're wrong about Mum. And I had to say, I'm really sorry. I've always been honest with you and told you what I think. And yes, fortunately, I've been wrong about Dad, but I don't think I'm wrong about Mum now. And it was only a few hours later, actually, that Mum died, and the children were sitting around the bed, holding her hand, and the dad was there in a wheelchair. And that family have done amazingly well. And I think it's actually because their parents have been so open with them about both parents being ill, and being open and honest all the way through. So perhaps that's my take-home message. Honesty is an investment in the rest of life. Thank you.
I think it's difficult sometimes because honesty is great, but I think for those parents that have been diagnosed quite late and actually haven't got their heads around it, you know, we know as professionals what would be the right thing to do, but it's very hard when the parent themselves can't begin to acknowledge, begin to process. Sometimes they kind of realise too late sometimes that actually it would have been good to, you know, involve the children. And I think the other thing sometimes parents say as well is, well, there's a lot of great stuff about preparing the children and doing journals. For those parents that actually can't do that, sometimes then they'll say, well, you know, it's like a pressure really to, you know, and so it's just a comment really. I think great for those that can, but the emotional stuff for some parents is just too great to.
Absolutely, and thank you very much for raising that, because there is no recipe, there is no right way, and you have to feel your way at time with those people at their pace and work through with them. But sometimes parents just need help to even have a phrase. You give them a phrase, so at least let the child know that you went to the hospital today to see the doctor and you're not feeling very well today. And that may be as much as they can cope with on either side. When they're having treatment, that just tell the child that they are having treatment and not pretend that they're not, you know, not pretend that they're going shopping or out for a coffee if they're going off to have something like chemotherapy or radiotherapy or whatever. So sometimes the role of the professional isn't to tell them what to do, but it can be to help them just find a way to cope with yet another burdensome dilemma. And yeah, you're right. We're not doing well at early diagnosis in this country, I'm afraid. We've got too many people being diagnosed too late. We're lagging behind Europe. We're not catching up. We're just following. And the latest figures that came out in the Lancet this week for the UK are not good. We're not doing well at early diagnosis. So I've survived, 1 year survival figures are not good. And that's a reality, but it doesn't help the person who knows themselves they've been diagnosed late. And you're right. I mean, it's funny how we all go through life believing that we might just have the ticket to immortality. We behave as if we're not going to be the one that something terrible happens to. So we put off and put off and put off preparing and leaving things in order.
I just wonder if I could go back to something you said earlier about us getting in sooner. Hi, I'm Sarah from City Hospice. I spend quite a lot of my time now with my children's work where patients will let me in to give that information or empower the patient as well and families. But Michelle and I run children's bereavement groups, and we're finding a group of 6 children, there's at least one that's completely kept in the dark.
Yeah.
And it's that one that I need to see more often. So
Yeah.
although I've been pushing for this for quite some years now, it's great out there. We are getting in sooner, more and more, just to deliver that basic info.
Yeah.
Last week alone, I met 2 children whose father is very much under life care. And I met up with their mother this week. And I said, how were the children after last week? And the little girl said, it was lovely. And can I go back and see Sarah? But she did use that word dead. And the mum said, but we told you Daddy won't get better. But she said, I didn't realise that meant dead. But that's okay. I'm going to go back and talk about what. And since then, has actually been able to go and talk to her father.
Yeah.
So it's just planting those little seeds sometimes.
Yeah.
But we we meet quite a lot of anger, don't we, with some of the children that haven't been told.
Yeah, I mean, that is a challenge too for healthcare, because I would agree with you. And actually the days of having, you know, the days of having the nurse who was there in the outpatient clinic with the consultant, unfortunately, have gone to a certain extent. There isn't that continuity, but actually that nurse, if she was one, it's usually she, there were some that male nurses, forgive me, but if she was one with really good skills, could actually informally spot and just have a little chat with people. And the days of clinics running in parallel and so on, where you could just have a little chat with people, have gone because of the pressures of budgeting and commissioning and getting through numbers and so on. So that, in a way, the system is now working against trying to provide that support early. And it's difficult to demonstrate the health economic advantage of having that involvement. I mean, personally, I would like to see a palliative care trained person. It doesn't have to be a specialist nurse, but somebody who's just got increased awareness, always be around within that vicinity. But I think the open talking by professionals, open talking in society, frees professionals up to talk more openly. When I graduated, the word cancer wasn't used with patients. You know, you had a lump or a tumour, or, I mean, all these stupid euphemisms. But actually, it was much more the public pressure to talk openly that moved the profession and gave them, in a way, permission to talk much more openly. But from that, you can see how old I am. Because now you wouldn't dream of not answering a patient's questions honestly, which is a good thing. Yeah. Okay, thank you.